Hi, everybody, and welcome to our review of two of Quantic Dreams' most well known and generally highly acclaimed games. We wanted to get our thoughts out there on these. We do have another video that will be out soon, which we'll call The Artistic Genius of Quantic Dream, where we just want to really talk in depth about them as a game studio and what they're trying to do and have achieved with games. But for now, we just want to give you our scores for both of these games. Now, Heavy Rain came out in 2010. Detroit Become Human, sorry, came out in 2018. Both, like, obviously very different stories, but obviously being part of Quantic, they're very similar in a lot of ways. And yeah, let's get straight into the most recent one, Detroit Become Human. Which, if anyone hasn't played it yet, it's a story essentially. It's set around 12 or so years in the future, or I think 20 years in the future, something like that, very near future anyway, in Detroit, which has become like this hub of like AI androids that have taken over a lot of the menial tasks from humans. And essentially, the story of three converging stories of androids that are on this, I guess, path to self-awareness and, I guess, several rights and self-actualization. Is that a fair assessment of the game?
Yep, pretty much. And I think, I guess this is a topic that a lot of people have covered a little bit, but I think I might as well just go out and say it straight away. I think Detroit covers it in a pretty unique and enjoyable way. I definitely wasn't like bored by this topic when Detroit was sort of presenting it to us. I think Quantic know how to take like a relatively, I guess, common formula, I suppose, and turn it into something that's still really, really unique and in some cases really like masterfully executed. So yeah, let's I guess get straight into sort of our scoring system on Detroit. So I guess the first one is a wow factor. What would you say about that one?
So wow factor would have definitely scored pretty high. So wow factor, for anyone that hasn't seen any of our other rating videos, is the intangible feeling and edge of your seat and wanting more, if you like, and how you felt when, say, you turn from the moment you turn it on to the first loading screen, you know, and the way through. So I gave it a 9.4 because, and I think you probably agree with that too. And my feeling on that is when you first turn it on, I was already expecting a lot. Like I'd already played a couple of the other Quantic games. I'd already seen what this game was all about, and when I played it, you know, from the main screen where you have the kind of AI assistant sort of behind there talking to you, to when you actually get into the story and you go as an android to go and investigate this rogue android that's holding a girl hostage on the edge of like a rooftop. It does wow you, I have to say. Like, the whole concept does wow you and it draws you into this world. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think it's a very quick sort of introduction to what's happening in this world, and you're very quickly, you know, as I said, it's sort of something that you can understand and grasp very quickly, but then Quantic does a really good job of sort of then applying depth to this concept that you can grasp very quickly. So, you know, you'll see what's going on immediately during these opening sequences of the game. But then as the game progresses, you know, you get way more depth to it. You know, like at this point, you're sort of looking at the sort of androids, like the AIs, like they're sort of the villains, and by the end of the game, they're definitely you'll have a different viewpoint for sure. So yeah, wow fact, definitely a very, very strong 9.4 on Detroit, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And that sort of brings us straight into the next factor that we bring on, which is graphics. And I've got to say, this one is a beautiful, beautiful looking game. You know, I thought the graphics are incredible. Again, right from the first loading screen and title screen, the main menu screen, it's just a really, really good looking game. And 9.7 I've given this one. So I think that's the highest I've ever scored any game on graphics so far. And I stand by that. I think the graphics are out of this world.
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to some of the you know, some of the stuff that is maybe some of the, like, you know, the future technology or the androids or whatever, I think it does a really, really good job of making you think that they're, you know, they're realistic, they're believable. It's not like, you know, it's not outrageous. It's not like a metallic skeleton. It's nothing absolutely like beyond belief. You see these androids and you think, wow, they're not actually that different to humans, and that's exactly what the graphics are designed for. I think that's what Quantic was going for. They want you to look at these characters, especially the androids, and think, yeah, they're believable, and it works.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a very good looking game. It definitely wows you from the start. And then how do you feel the gameplay came out?
Yeah, so I think gameplay is it's a solid formula that Quantic has, where you often control multiple characters. You have sort of these branching storylines that eventually converge into sort of the same thing usually. And yeah, in all honesty, I think gameplay for Detroit is a pretty strong 8.5 as well. It's just shy of sort of the 9 mark, which is where I'd really start to say it's like excellent and outstanding. And the only reason why it hasn't quite reached that high, I think, is just because Quantic games all sort of follow the same formula, as I said. So you'll see later when we talk about Heavy Rain as well, and perhaps if we talk about Beyond Two Souls, it's all sort of it's the same formula. So the gameplay doesn't really surprise you in any real sense. Like, they often add new mechanics. So in this game, there are some mechanics that the androids have. I think his name is Marcus. I think.
Yep.
He had like sort of the parkour mechanic where he sort of he like scans sort of the best possible route up a wall, and then you have to pick the right route. And if you do it wrong, it's not too big of a deal for most of the game. But then later on, that mechanic becomes like quite important, because if you do the wrong one, like he can die. So. Yeah, it's nothing fantastic, but definitely 8.5 is a very, very strong score still, and it sticks to that formula very well with a few minor things that it branches out on.
Yeah, I'd agree the same. Like, it's not in terms of like actual gameplay. I mean, we're not talking about a game that this is a story, right? This is not really a game, so to speak, which we obviously will go into more depth in our more in-depth video on Quantic Dream. But it's artwork, right? It's not really a game, so it's not really designed as gameplay. It's designed as a tool for getting you through the story and experiencing the story and contributing to the story. And so it is actually a fairly limited in that sense. You walk around, you can interact with a few items, you can run into someone to talk to, and there's a couple of moments where you have maybe some like whatever they are, like what are they called, real time, like
quick time events.
Quick time events, that's right, to kind of get through that. So it's not like I don't know, like a God of War or a Witcher in that sense, that where it's really gameplay heavy. It's really designed to get you through this kind of artsy story, and so it does exactly that. So it's hard to not score it that level, because that's what it was aiming for. However, this is not a game to buy for gameplay, which is why I think an 8.5 is probably the highest you can give it, if you're being honest. And I think 8.5 is fair, because it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's just not a gameplay game. And in terms of that story, it's probably a little bit surprising, but I mean, I actually think the story is a little bit disappointing. Very predictable. In the end, obviously you can make different choices and that breeds different outcomes, but in terms of like what they turned it into, it's a little bit like I feel like it could have been so much more than what basically turned out to be another like civil rights story, really. And maybe this is easy for me to say, but it's just a little bit of a boring topic. And maybe it's because people might turn around and get political and say, well, it's because you've got them all already, you've got rights, you don't need to worry. And maybe that's true, but I was expecting this bigger, deeper, like, look at humanity, and what the impact of AI was on humanity, in almost like a cyberpunk way, rather than in what it turned out to be, which is just kind of like a civil rights story where, Marcus starts leading these androids on a march and uses even like a Black Power style like motion at one point. You can, and it's a little bit, I don't know, like it just kind of was like, oh, that you had this whole big thing and you could have done all of this and you went to that level. I was just a little bit disappointed with that.
Yeah, agreed. I think, they had such a, I guess, vast setup ready for a fantastic story, and I honestly think they squandered it a little bit. They could have taken it in a much different direction, and it could have been a lot better. But I think they sort of took it in I don't want to go so far as to say a lazy direction, but it definitely felt like the easiest direction for them to go in, and the direction that would obviously get them the most sort of like mainstream appeal. And I think personally that sort of led to a bit of disappointment in the story. So I think a 7 from a Quantic game, which is supposed to be, a very story-driven art game, I think a 7 is actually, quite low compared to what you should expect from a Quantic game. So, not that 7 is low in general. I just think it's for a Quantic game, 7 is quite a, it's not an impressive score for a Quantic game story.
And just on that, it was also, for what it was almost a little bit too short as well, if anything.
Agreed. We finished it in pretty much one day, if I remember correctly. We played through it one time, and we basically
one of our
playthroughs.
It was in a day. It was in less than a day, wasn't it? We actually, because I think we that day we were like this. We're playing, we're getting stuck in. We're playing the whole day on PlayStation, and I think it was about, realistically, I think it was about 6 or 7 hours. With a couple of breaks for going to the toilet, eating food, and that was, that was it really. And that was just a solid playthrough, and that's not really long enough, if you ask me, for such a game. Like, it could have been, as I said, even with the path they chose, it could have still been something bigger and better than what it was, even with that path they chose. But they definitely went down a disappointing path. What I just want to say on the next part, and which kind of brings it back up a little bit, was world and atmosphere. Which, again, for anyone that wants to know, is how do you feel? Like, how is the world that they've created in general? What's the atmosphere feel like? Does it, it's not quite immersion, because that's another topic for us, but it's, how do you feel when you're playing it? And I think that one scored pretty well. I think we've gone for an 8 on that one, and I think that's a fair score. And I just wanted to make a couple of points. There's a couple of the actors that are in the game are very well-known actors in some of the, in movies, at various levels. Like, you've got, I think Clancy Brown is his name, as the main detective, like, partner for Connor, the android.
Yeah.
And you'll recognize him if you ever look him up. He's great. He was also in The Mandalorian recently, as the Zabrak male, for anyone that's watched The Mandalorian. He's just a really solid actor, and he kind of always plays that kind of military guy / police guy, really, the gruff, kind of grumpy, surly kind of detective or military guy. And he's great at that. And his was almost the best, like, character arc in the whole game, really. But there was also, the old man, I think Carl, his name was, who was Marcus's, like, owner. The actor of that one, anyone that's watched the Alien movies will realize that. So it's Lance Henriksen, or Hendrickson, whichever one that is, I can never remember. But he basically is in all but one Alien movie, all but one, which is just incredible form. But he plays an android as well, and in that one too, which is quite ironic. But he like, these actors kind of create credibility to the storytelling nature of the games, but they add a certain class as well, and I thought that, like, that really helped. I think that really helped the storytelling, like, ability. There was a couple of other actors that are, like, lower level and all the rest of it, but ultimately pretty good. And I think that, in terms of the atmosphere, like, with the graphics, and when you do have missions where you sort of walk through a bit of, like, Detroit or whatever, like, you really feel like you're in this world. You do, to be fair.
Yeah, honestly, on this point as well, I think actually the part where you feel the most sort of, I guess, connected to this world is actually quite early on, when you're first playing as, I think it's Connor, and he's out in out in Detroit streets, and you see some other androids, you see a lot of people. There's, like, an android getting harassed by some like activists or whatever as well. And you're sort of just performing menial tasks for your owner, but it sort of sets up the atmosphere for this game very, very well. After that sort of first sort of section of the game with the android with a human hostage, you see that, and then you see what the game's sort of going to be building to, and then it comes back to a much calmer sort of look at just what the world is like normally, and it really does. Sort of sucks you in and makes the world believable, and I definitely think that deserves some praise as well.
Yeah, so that's you were Marcus. That was your first intro to playing as Marcus.
Oh yeah, Marcus. Sorry, yeah.
I think you're going to the shop, if I remember right, to pick up the paint for your artist owner. And yeah, like you can listen to like a sort of preacher preaching about the dangers of like androids, and like, you know, you can watch as like an android takes a young girl to the park, for example, to play, you know, and does that kind of stuff. And it really helps build the world. But I mean, all of the intro level like missions, if you like, or parts, with the three characters do that. So obviously the very first one is Connor, and you know, your intro is investigating, going to this apartment in a hostage situation. That's pretty awesome. Then you have, I think it's Kara, who's the female one, who basically was broken, wake up in the shop and is broken, and your owner, who's like this, you know, former factory worker in Detroit, rough bloke, like basically comes to pick you up and drive you home. And you know, it's all very good world building, which is something that Quantic are great at. And I just felt that as the game went on, the immersion became a little bit less. But that was just me. But that's, you know, for the next point of or the next point but one. So what did you rate the soundtrack?
Yeah, so I think the soundtrack was, you know, it wasn't insanely stand out, but it also, you know, there was nothing negative about it. So for this one, we've given it a fair 7, I think, which I can't really argue any lower, and I can't really argue any higher either. There was no specific themes or moments where the soundtrack really sort of hit home, but there was also no moments where it sort of took you out of it. It was always it always fitted the mood, and was fairly, you know, it was definitely passable and above average. What would you think?
Yeah, I think 7's fair. Like, it was a solid soundtrack. There's 2 moments that really stick with me in terms of soundtrack still to this day. I mean, I played through it 3 times now, and the first bit where you're investigating and sorting out this hostage situation, there's a soundtrack to that part which really fits, and it's really kind of AI style. Like, you could definitely picture it in like a Black Mirror episode. It was pretty good. And then the other one was also fairly near to the start, believe it or not, which is when Kara kind of grabs Alice and they run after shooting, spoiler alert, the owner, and then run to jump on the bus, and there's this like emotional music. Both of those are stand out for 2 different reasons. One is the first one fit, and the second one was it almost overpowered the scene a bit too much. Like, it was like, yes, it's emotional, but it's not that emotional. And maybe I'm being a bit extreme on this, but yeah, I felt like it's a good soundtrack, but not a great one.
Yeah, agreed. It's nothing ridiculously stand out, so I think, yeah, the 7 is a completely fair score. So moving straight on to our overall immersion, because this definitely connects with the, you know, the world atmosphere and the soundtrack. So overall immersion, I think we've given a slightly higher score than the soundtrack. We've gone for a 7.5 here, which I think, again, you know, due to the overall world building that Quantic has a very, very good reputation for, and the general soundtrack overall leads to a pretty immersive experience for the most part. What would you say? Do you think 7.5 is a fair score as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's enough that pulls you out. Like, for example, obviously it's not an open world game, which is fine. It's not that style game, but obviously that always, for me, pulls back the immersion a little bit. The only time when that kind of linear nature works is, for me anyway, these days, is on, like, say, first-person shooter games. You know what I mean? Where, like, you know, or in situations where it clearly does make sense, but sometimes when you're just roaming around the streets, like, you know, you get to a point and like there's just a thing in front of you that stops you from going further, and it's like, okay, that's weird. But like, you know, that's a really small like thing. I think the bigger thing was there was a few moments for me, and this is maybe story as well, but there was a few moments for me where I love Quantic. Sorry, I love Quantic. I've got a lot of their games. I love what they're trying to do, and definitely want to see more. But it felt like they sold out a little bit in times on this game, and you could feel the exact moments when you could, without going too much in like depth of like today's politics and some of the agenda, but it did feel like there was a lot of that crept in still, which hadn't happened before this. But it was, as I said it before, it went very civil rightsy, and it went very like, you know, I don't know. Like to me, it felt like there was a few bits where they sold out a little bit in order to get more people invested. I don't know. Don't blame them for it, but that's what it felt like.
Yeah, agreed. I think as we sort of said in the story section, it definitely. I guess again, I said earlier that I didn't want to use the word lazy, but it does definitely feel like they sort of took the easier options in a few places that definitely sort of take you out of it. And I guess this is I'm not necessarily like knocking the game, but there's definitely some points where you feel like it could have gone in a much better direction, and then it sort of took the direction that first came to your mind when you're thinking, when you're trying to predict what's going to happen. You often are right in this game, and I think that's not always what you want from a Quantic game, because I think again they're usually pretty good on this side of things, and I think maybe they didn't quite ace it in this game.
Yeah, and look, we've made a conscious decision to not try and go too political on a lot of stuff that we say, but I do want to get this one quick thing off my chest. And we hear a lot these days about how games represent a lot of people badly, for example women, and that there's always like white heroes or whatever. And I just want to say this, like in terms of the character base in this game, right? You have the you've got the kind of Detective Connor, who's obviously like this white android, right? Not that it should mean anything when you're an android, because actually race doesn't matter when you're an android, because you're an android.
It's fabricated, yeah.
Right, like it's obviously not true. However, obviously it does have this effect. So you've got this situation where, on the most part, the kind characters, the leadership characters, and and stuff are female and non-white. And that's so for example, Clancy Brown's character, detective, I think Hank he's called in it, is this drunk that hates androids at the start, and he has a really good character arc because he comes around to them a little bit by the end, right? If you do the right choices. However, the leader of like the kind of rebellion or the resistance is becomes Marcus, because reasons. Like when he arrives at Jericho, which is this ship where these androids who have what do they call them? Was it Rogue? Was that what they called them?
I think so, something like that. Like just the ones that are there's basically a sequence for every android in this game where they sort of break. You basically you sort of unshackle yourself, and you sort of like in gameplay terms, you sort of like, it feels like your android's like punching their own view until it shatters, and then you're basically like, they do what they want after that, and
Right.
Anyways, carry on.
so this happens, and Marcus just sort of goes to discover it, and then lands in there, and then instantly becomes leader. And then like even the female interest android in there is like, she's kind of, I think she's Hispanic, but she's kind of like white, and she's like kind of a bitch, like just wanting you to kill, right? And then you've got like Kara, who's this protective kind of mother figure for Alice, who, spoiler alert for anyone, super spoiler alert, Alice turns out to be an AI android as well. But these two are like kind always. And then they got a protector who's like a big black android, right? And then when they're trying to like get to the Canadian border, one of the people that takes them into their house is a black woman, for example. And like, this is all fine, right? I actually have no issue with them doing that. It's just in the current climate politically, where we're constantly being told, gamers are just white males live in their mum's basement and they just hate anything that's not white men. It's not true. It's just not true. And the message of games portray anything that's not a white male badly is just not true. And it feels like they were very conscious, were Quantic, to deliberately not show that, right? Like the only kind white dude that I remember in the game was Carl, like Marcus's owner, who's like a rich white dude, ironically.
Yeah, it definitely sort of feels like they have a bit more of, I guess, an agenda than they have in their previous games. And I guess, especially when it comes to, parts like the immersion, it does start to sort of shine through, and you start to feel a little bit pulled out of it, because you're feeling like a lot of the decisions are fabricated rather than a natural thing that's just occurred in the world based on what's happening.
Right, but specifically when you start to see the story that they've gone more of a civil rights path as opposed to what it could have been, which was much bigger, and then you see that the leader of that like civil rights movement is a black AI, right? you're like, it's kind of obvious what they're doing, right? It's actually more like this is a subtext actually for a black civil rights thing, really, is what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And for me, that was disappointing because it's like, look, I get that that's an issue for a lot of people, and it's still obviously an issue today in a lot of places. I understand that in a lot of cases, right? And I'm being a fucking dwarf Viking. I'm not, I don't have to worry about that. However, it just feels to me like had this story that could have been about the whole of humanity, not just one race. That ultimately, in the face of AI, race should no longer mean anything, in my opinion. But there you go. That was just me. So that's like a quick rant over. Sorry about that. I just had to get that off my chest. I feel like that's one of the real things that I've pulled down the immersion for and the story for. And as a result, I've also given it a 5 for met expectations. And the reason being is that it didn't really beat my expectations, but it wasn't less than my expectations either. So met expectations is a 5. That means it's hit it dead on.
Yeah, agreed. I think, having seen this game before launch and knowing that it was Quantic, and then, having played the game, having gotten it, nothing really changed. What you see is what you get, and it's exactly what is sort of on the tin when you're buying a Quantic game, or on the case, as it may be. And I definitely think a 5 is exactly sort of baseline for what we expected from the game. We got exactly what we predicted. And I guess in some cases, in some cases it exceeded. In some cases it was a bit less. So yeah, we've just sort of averaged it out to a 5, and I think that's completely fair. And I cannot argue a higher or lower score on that one.
Yeah, and I think so. The overall score that we've gone for when you average those out is 7.75. So it's an above average game. It's a good game. It's definitely worth a play. But is it the game that it could have been? Hell no. Is it the game that is worth paying full price for? Hell no. Is it the game that's worth getting as part of, I know on like PlayStation Network, for example, for PlayStation players? I think there's a pack with, no, I'm wrong, sorry, Beyond Two Souls was in a pack with Heavy Rain, but I'm sure there'll be a pack with Detroit and something else as well. So is it worth getting it like that if it's on discount? Yes, absolutely. Like, give it a go. There's a little bit of replay value because you can have some different like outcomes, and it's kind of interesting to see different ways. Like when we played it together, it was very different to how I played it by myself, right? Like it was very different, and one of the characters had a much better result, the other one had a much worse result. Like it's just the way it worked. My personal final thought on this one, you may have something to say afterwards, but this my personal final thought is it's the game that set out to achieve something great and didn't get there. It could have been so much better than what it was. It started so well, and just as the game went on, I just got more and more disappointed, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty solid summary. The game itself is basically a cookie cutter Quantic Dream game. Where some of the other games may have really stood out on their own as a notable title. I think Detroit Become Human is kind of just it's kind of just what you would expect from Quantic, and it didn't really break the mold in any particular way. And a 7.75 is still a pretty high overall score, and it's definitely a score that's high enough to warrant you purchasing it and playing it for yourself and maybe formulating your own opinion. But yeah, I definitely think in summary, Quantic have done better works than this.
For sure. So let's get on to Heavy Rain, which came out in 2010. What Heavy Rain was essentially was a game about a grieving parents who lost their child in was it a car accident? Was that what did it?
A car. The child got. I think it was.
Yeah, this dumbass kid who just decided at the mall to walk off. Obviously. So the dad starts to blame himself. There's a second son still around. Dad blames himself. He's an architect or whatever he is, and they obviously end up splitting up because the dad can't basically forgive himself. So he spirals into depression. And then shit happens with the second son. And I guess the story from there is the investigation and how to what the father has to go through to try and get his son back, pretty much. Main characters you play as was his name Who's the main character's name? It wasn't Ethan.
Yeah.
Ethan Mars, I think it was.
Yeah.
So you had Shaun and Jason, wasn't it? The two sons. Jason was the first son, and Shaun was the second one, right?
Yeah.
Can't miss that. It's very memeable as well.
It's very memeable.
then you played as FBI agent with this technology, this like pretty awesome technology to help him kind of try and get on this investigation to catch what's called the origami killer, a serial killer working in the area whose call sign was an origami like work, who basically captured children when it was in rain, and by the time the rain was gone, the kid would be dead. And then you also play as a PI who was also working on trying to find the origami killer. And then I think there's a couple of bits where you play as a female journalist as well later on, don't you?
Yeah.
So I think those are the main characters. As a game concept, it was fairly, relatively fresh at the time. Like, there wasn't a huge amount of games out there that had kind of done this storytelling, heavy, choice-heavy style before. Like, obviously there was some, but not on the level that this game was doing it. And it felt pretty revolutionary to me. I didn't get to play it until 2013, very early 2013. And so, yeah, I loved it. Do you want to get straight into the scores now?
Yeah, we might as well go straight into the wow factor, because I think, it's sort of our most subjective score point on these games, and I think this game scored a very, very high 9.2, which is actually slightly lower than the wow factor of Detroit when we first played it. And I think that's simply just because of the change in setting. I think with Detroit you had some very sort of eye-catching cyberpunk-esque with all the AIs and the androids and whatnot, whereas Heavy Rain sort of, it's purposefully bleak. It brings you in with the rain as the motif, and that's it's still definitely captured us. 9.2 is absolutely like a phenomenal score for wow factor, but definitely slightly less so than how quickly Detroit pulled us in. But I think Heavy Rain's opening sequences are also a little bit less. They're a little bit weaker than Detroit's, because you sort of start with the very memeable mall scene very early on, with Ethan yelling for Jason, his first son. And I'm sure all you have to do is search it up, Heavy Rain Jason, but he sort of just screams it at everything. And I think there was a bug or a mod or something where he could scream it during dialogue options that weren't like the actual they weren't the time where it was supposed to be happening, so he'd just be screaming Jason whilst doing horrible things to himself. So
I also quite enjoyed the show.
That one's good too. Yeah.
So there was a lot of that in this game, yeah. Although I think that's probably also because of the coding and everything that was available at the time when this game came out 10 years ago. So you have to realize, like, in terms of what else was coming out that sort of year game wise, like, this was still pretty ahead of the curve in terms of what they were trying to achieve. It was not an easy thing to do. 10 years ago, Mass Effect 2 came out, which is another absolutely amazing game. But in terms of like some of the things, it didn't have what this had, right? In terms of the way it worked. So I think it was a really good game. I never got the bug when I played it through, but I certainly had a chuckle in some of those YouTube videos online. Yeah, I was going to say with the wow factor, you're absolutely right when you talk about the setting. The setting definitely is a big factor in that. Not just the setting, but also like the graphic system is obviously, like you say, a bit more bleak. The general story of it is obviously a lot lower of a level. So you're still I think, wow, you're still drawn in, but you're not. It's not kind of on this grand scale that Detroit has. It's not with the color palette that Detroit has, and so yeah, like I don't think it quite scores quite as highly. And then graphically, why don't we talk about graphics? Obviously, being 8 years younger or older, I should say, than Detroit, I think it's still pretty good for the time. And 8.6 is what I think it's worth. What do you think?
Yeah, I can't really disagree with an 8.6. I think the game was intentionally designed to be very bleak, and the rain is the huge motif here. So, graphically, it doesn't need to be very colorful, and in every scene, it's usually pretty it's pretty dark and dull and like sepia tone. And the sorts of browns and grays, those are the colors that you see the most. And it really works, honestly. It's got its own artistic style, and obviously the graphics lends to that. There was a vision in that, and they pulled it off. So I think 8.6 is a very strong score for a game that's as old as Heavy Rain is.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it's like a borderline cyberpunk noir game, which we'll probably talk about in story a little bit, or the atmosphere, or various points. But you can almost say it's almost a cyberpunk noir game, like cyberpunk in the sense that there's this like futuristic technology that is used by the FBI that feels a little bit that way. Although it's, I can see if people say it's definitely not, and that's fine. But it's got elements of that. But it's also got that noir element, like getting a PI, to go and investigate, and, that side of things too. Like that's a little bit noir era, which kind of, again, build into that, graphic package. It's not a game that is this frills and bright and like it's not a Halo, in that sense, right? And I guess on a quick note as well, like we'll talk about this more, but one of the biggest themes in this game is obviously a dad going through depression, and then what lengths he will go to rescue his other son. And depression is obviously a big thing, but obviously when you're conveying depression, you're going to have a depressing little bleak house, which is exactly what we were given. And actually, the house that they lived in, or he lived in then, looked a hell of a lot like the house that the character from Detroit lived in, Kara's owner, like a Detroit. But it was set in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. Not Philadelphia. Yeah, I think it's Philadelphia.
I think you're right. Yeah,
one of those Pennsylvania cities. In any case, and they went there, and they, some of the backgrounds you see are like the steelworks like factories that you had in. So I think it was Pittsburgh actually, which is where I think it's called Steel City for a reason over there. And basically, that is supposed to be that kind of bleaker environment, and it really works. And I think that I'd actually like to have given the graphics higher, but there were a few bugs. Not least, I know this is more in something else, but not least the shouting of the sons' names randomly if you got that bug. So yeah, 8.6, very good score. Not quite as good as, or not really anywhere near Detroit, but 8 years older, pretty good.
I can understand.
What do you reckon of the gameplay?
So again, I think we sort of touched on this in Detroit, and I don't think it takes too long to explain the same point on Heavy Rain. But I think in 8.5, Quantic never they're, as you said, they're more just vessels for the art form. They're more of a story than they're much less so a game, I suppose. They're like an interactive story at best. So the gameplay being an 8.5 is basically us saying that like it services what Quantic want perfectly, but it can't really score it any higher than that with a clear conscience, as it's not really built to be a very gameplay heavy game. A lot of it is sort of making choices, or completing the quick time events, or figuring stuff out. Like I think in this game later on, there's you get a few snippets of an address, which is when Ethan's trying to find his kid Shaun, and if you're not using your brain, you could pick the wrong address, and that'll be the end of the game there. Basically, you won't get to save him in time. But or maybe it was the reporter lady actually. But either way, the gameplay itself isn't where these games shine at all. But I think an 8.5 is very strong because it services exactly what the story needs. Would you agree with that?
I gotta get out of here.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just like Detroit, it's not a gameplay heavy game. So I think the same score is probably fair, because what it does is exactly what it needs to do to facilitate the story moving forward and the choices being made. And there's like quick time events that, I guess the point of all of this is that each character that you have could die at any point, and that changes the story. I mean, the only one that can't die, is, and spoiler alert, 10 years ago, obviously, is the PI, who it turns out is the origami killer. So he's the only one that you can't be killed before the final bit, because he's important to be in the final bit. But essentially, every other character can be killed at various points. And in fact, my first playthrough, the reporter died in the basement of that crazy dude. I just, for some reason, I missed it and I couldn't get her out. So she died. So yeah, it does. It affects and changes the story from that point on. But is it a gameplay focused game? Not really. So you can't score it higher than 8.5. In terms of story, I think it's a story that does score higher than Detroit. I give it an 8 because I think it's a pretty good story. It's pretty compelling. But I think that there's a lot of like conveniences and a lot of like predictability as well. Like, some of the things that do happen are a little bit on the, in retrospect, predictable. The origami killer reveal was a bit odd. It didn't feel like it was going to be him, but it kind of worked. But like, there's things like Ethan, sleeping with the reporter chick is a bit weird and a bit like convenient just to get that in the story. To be honest, it doesn't.
Oh
really
yeah,
make
it's
sense.
like that. It seems like the last thing he'd be thinking about. In all honesty, like he's literally.
Yeah.
This is like during a time where he's being forced to undergo like almost like jigsaw like contraptions from like the Saw movies. Like he literally has to cut his finger off on camera to prove that he's like a worthy father to save his son. He has to like crawl under like live electricity lines, and he's thinking about having sex with this random reporter chick.
He's got to crawl on broken glass,
in
a tunnel that fire kind of blows through at some point.
Yeah,
it's pretty shit. Like, to be like, no, before I do that, sorry, son, if you die, you die. But I mean, Daddy's got to get his end away. Like, what the hell? It's just, it doesn't make sense.
Maybe he's just trying to acquire a new mother figure for his son. Maybe that was part of the challenge.
Well, maybe, or he's resigned himself to the fact that, like, okay, that's the second son down the tube. Better start getting ready and making a new one.
Might as well see if I can make a new one. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, hopefully my swimmers still work. So yeah, no, it didn't make sense in terms of at a human level. It just was a convenience to kind of get it into the story, which, you'd think, okay, this is the thing, right? We keep talking about Quantic as a story-based game, and we'll talk about this more in depth in a different video, but neither of these have really scored, like, they've scored solid scores, but not like amazing blow you away scores of story, right? Which kind of is weird. It's weird. So again, are they story-based games, or are they just games to show you what could be in games, right? So it's a debate, but I mean, the debate is for the other video, but for the meantime, like 8 for story it's a good story. It's serviceable, but it could have been a lot better.
Yeah, so moving on to the world and atmosphere, and I think this is another one where the game scored pretty highly. We've given it another 8. And I think, as I've sort of touched on before, I think the main thing here is sort of the motif of rain and just the constant bleakness of everything around the characters. Even in scenes where it's broad daylight, you still have these sorts of greys and browns and all these colors that it's very washed out and very atmospheric. And I think the game really, really does a good job in drawing you into that.
Yeah, spot on. And I think there's like scenes where, obviously, like near the start, where you're playing with your sons when they're both still around in the back garden waiting for the birthday party. It's kind of cool. And other parts where it does feel like you're in this actual world, and they've done that very well. And again, of course, the choices that you make affecting other things do shape some of that as well. How characters respond to you, for example, depending on what choices you've made, makes that a thing too. But yeah, I like it. I mean, I think an 8 is another solid score. To be honest, it's really hard for me to ever give higher than like an 8 to an 8.5 for a game that's not like free roam open world type game, because I think it's easier in a sense to get the world and atmosphere right because you're not making as much of it, right? But at the same time, it's harder because you've got to make it more alive because there's less of it, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So anyway, I think an 8 is a really good score. Soundtrack wise, not gonna lie, played through it, forgot a lot of the soundtrack already again, but none of it seemed out of place. So I've gone for 7 on this one because I think it was obviously good. Nothing seemed shit, but don't really remember much of it. I mean, do you remember any of it?
No, not particularly. I think it's more so the ambience and like, you know, the sound effects of like the, you know, rain hitting the roof, or like, you know, during some of the memory sequences, like it gets a bit more washed out in terms of like the sound effects, and I think it works very well, but it's nothing, you know, it's nothing absolutely fantastic. There are no standout tracks that really like just instantly like get me going again. It's sort of just every soundtrack sort of just fits the moment and doesn't necessarily enhance it beyond what it normally would have been anyways.
Definitely. How do you feel about the overall immersion?
So I think this is pretty strong as well. I think 7.5 is what we've decided to give it, and I think you definitely agree there. It's sort of just a combination of the atmosphere, soundtrack, and you know, just sort of everything up until this point is what this one is sort of a culmination of. And yeah, I think 7.5 is a very fair score here. You're immersed for the most part. I think obviously there are a few, you know, if you did get that bug, for example, with Ethan screaming the name of Shaun or Jason, it's, you know, it instantly pulls you out. But we didn't get that bug, so there was nothing like absolutely like unacceptable that drew us out of the game. But certainly there was nothing. You know, it's not the most amazingly immersive experience either. So I think 7.5 is a very strong score, but it's nothing, you know, ridiculously outstanding.
Yeah, agreed. It felt like you're in the story for the most part, apart from obviously a few of those inconsistencies and conveniences. It's not the most immersive game I've ever played, but it's definitely better than average. So I think that's right. Yeah. All right. So, what do you think about how it met expectations?
So for me, this was my first proper Quantic Dreams game that I got into. So when I say this score, just bear in mind it's a little bit biased, because I think for us it was sort of it was before we really had any expectations from Quantic. So we've given it an 8. And I think that's a pretty damn strong score for met expectations. Again, just a reminder, like a 5 would be, it was exactly what we expected before buying it. And I think on this one, it absolutely exceeded those expectations. We didn't know exactly what to expect, and I think we were quite impressed with what they managed to deliver here. And I think an 8 is a very, very strong score, and not to be sniffed at all.
Agreed. It was my first foray into Quantic, and it was not based on it being Quantic. It was based on the game and what a colleague of mine at a job that I was doing at the time actually told me about, to be honest. And when he played it, he was like, "You've got to play this. You've got to play this." And it took me another 3 years and moving to the other side of the world before I eventually got to play it. And my expectations were fairly high. However, I tempered them by the fact that he told me basically that it was going to be similar to like an LA Noire, and it's not at all similar to an LA Noire, but I can see why he would say that in terms of some choice and a little bit of freedom, I guess, but not really, like, it's not really the same. So as soon as I started playing it, I realized it's not the same, and suddenly my expectations were wide open, and I've given it an 8 because to me it's far exceeded my expectations. It was a really good game in its own right, but was it perfect? No. So an 8 is a good score, I think. Yeah.
Agreed. 8 is a very strong score. Again, 5 would be, it literally just was exactly what we expected, and 8 is it's far exceeded those. So definitely a very strong score here. So overall, I think these average out to an 8.1, which is just a little bit higher than Detroit, and I think we can both agree that this is probably fair. I think both of us liked Heavy Rain a little bit more as a game.
100%.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely a better game. The story, whilst it had flaws, didn't like disappoint in that same way. That Detroit Become Human story did. It didn't seem like it was subject to any potential agenda or selling out. It just was a game made for being a work of art, which it was. It accomplished most of what I think it was looking to accomplish as well. And I think that Heavy Rain is a game that, whilst in some respects it's starting to age a little bit now, I think is still a very solid effort. I've played it through again quite recently actually, and anyone that hasn't played it at all or for a while, I definitely suggest going back and doing it, and just have a couple of saves or whatever, and just really enjoy the fact that like one thing you do can lead you down a vastly different path, and how that's in itself is a fantastic work of art. Overall, very good game, and I think fully deserves to score an 8.1.
Yeah, and I think just again to sort of touch on the comparison between the two, I think both games are definitely worth picking up. If there is some sort of pack with both of them in it, 100%, I recommend you pick it up. But if for whatever reason you're just getting into Quantic Games and you want to know which one maybe you should start at, maybe you're wondering whether to go from the latest one, Detroit, and go backwards. I would certainly recommend that you actually start earlier and begin with Heavy Rain, because it's just a slightly better game overall.
Yeah, and if you want to, if it just as a point of comparison of that scoreline, for anyone that's thinking, oh, 8, I've used to seeing games get 9s and 10s and all the rest of it. We've recently reviewed Red Dead Redemption 2. Not sure if that video is up yet, but it will be. So if you haven't seen that one yet, go and watch that now. But we rated that one as an 8 out of 10. So actually, Heavy Rain race, 1 decimal place higher, which is a testament to how good of a game it actually was, really.
Yeah, and I think another review we've recorded recently, which is both of our sort of, favorite game as of right now. It scores definitely higher than Heavy Rain, but it's sort of in the same ballpark of about one score. So definitely don't think that 8.1 or even the 7.75 for Detroit is bad at all. These are very, very good scores, and we don't really like to give high scores unless we think they deserve it, and we consider anything above a 7 is pretty high. So both of these games are definitely worth a go, just not quite as good as some of the other games we've reviewed.
That's right. All right, guys, see you in the next video.
Yeah, thank you for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them down below, and maybe if you want to see any other reviews, definitely let us know. And with that, thanks for watching.
See ya.
I hope it's not too late.
I knew you'd come and save me.
Ethan! I know who the killer is, Ethan. I can prove your innocence.
Congratulations, Ethan. You succeeded. You're the father that I have been looking for all these years. The man capable of giving his own life to save his son. I'm afraid that's not possible. I'm going to have to kill you both. I'm sorry. You are my husband.